Hello, welcome to our presentation today. Our presentation today is Runestones, their origin and development. We're going to trace the origin and development of the fascinating practice of raising a runestone from the very beginnings to the migration period through the Viking Age and beyond. My name's Tristan Mueller-Vollmer, and I'm a librarian at Waunakee Public Library. Our presenter tonight is Tristan Mueller-Vollmer. He is working on his dissertation at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And his dissertation examines the naming methods used within families on Swedish Viking Age runestones. In addition to personal names and runology, he's also interested in language change and cultural contact in the Nordic region, and the mythology, religion, and visual culture of pre-Christian Scandinavia. He is also an author, and the book is called The Vikings, Facts and Fiction, which explore 11 popular misconceptions about the Vikings. And I should also mention that Tristan spent the last year in Sweden. And we can begin from here. Tristan.
All right, thank you for the introduction, and we can get right started. So, 1 second. Okay, so what are runestones anyway? So a runestone at its most basic is just a stone carved in a runic alphabet. And most of them are freestanding, like the one you see on the left here. Although there are some also that are carved into flat, exposed rock faces. So those would not be portable exactly. Not that a 2-ton stone is that portable, but you get the point. Runestones are mostly memorial stones for deceased ancestors, but they are not gravestones, so they're not associated with the grave of the person that they're commemorating. And they're also not these small stones with individual runes carved into them that you see on the right here, that some people use for divination purposes these days. This is pretty much a modern phenomenon, so we're not really talking about that here. And runestones and other runic inscriptions are important because they are the earliest written sources in Scandinavia. So they can tell us quite a lot about the language and culture. Runes were not static through time, so they evolved over the centuries, and there are 3 main alphabets that we're going to talk about. There's actually a 4th alphabet, but that was used in England and not in Scandinavia, so we're going to not talk about that one today. The oldest alphabet is the Elder Futhark, and this may actually be based on the Roman alphabet, and we think this because there was a large amount of cultural contact between the Roman Empire and the Germanic peoples to the north, right around the time when runes begin appearing in the archaeological record. And the other reason is because many of the rune forms very strongly resemble the Latin letters, which represent the same sounds. So if you can see the slide here, you can see the F looks very much like a Latin F, and the U looks like it's just been turned upside down, and the R looks pretty much identical, and the H is very similar, and S, T, B, and so on. So this is probably not a coincidence, and there we have it. So these are used between roughly 100 and 700, and between about 500 and 700, we start to see changes happening, and the language is changing, and the runic alphabet is also transforming, and it transforms into the Younger Futhark, which is used during the Viking Age, so between about 700 and 1130. And we actually have two variants here. The top one is the Danish variant, and the one below it is the Swedish and Norwegian variant. And so you can see that there's some similarities. They aren't too different. So then after about 1130, we see more changes happening, and we end up with the medieval Futhark, which is used until about 1500. And after that, it gets replaced by the Latin alphabet. So how do runestones fit into this? Well, in the oldest runic alphabet, we have 65 runestones. And some of them are fragments, others are damaged, and many of them are difficult to interpret. But 65 is how many we have, unless we find more, which is not that likely. Then in the younger Futhark, during the Viking Age, we have 2,399 runestones. So it's just kind of an explosion of runestones. And so those are raised until about 1130, and then they kind of fall out of fashion, and we don't see them anymore. Occasionally, we do find runic grave slabs in the medieval Futhark, and these were kind of different from the freestanding type of runestone. They use different vocabulary and different types of ornamentation. So it's really kind of a different sort of thing. So let's see where runestones are found. So of the 2,399 Viking Age runestones, an amazing 2,057 are in Sweden. So Sweden has most of them, 86%. And then Denmark is next with about 248. Then Norway has 51. And then there's about 40 in the British Isles. And this is because wherever the Vikings went, they took their writing and their runestone traditions, and they raised runestones where they were settling, and that's how we end up with so many there. Then we have one from the Viking Age in the Faroe Islands. One has been discovered in Finland, and one in the Ukraine. And there are no Viking Age runestones in Iceland at all. And even within Sweden, the distribution of runestones is not at all even. And actually, about half of the Swedish runestones are located in this dark red area here, which is Uppland province. So that's pretty remarkable. All right, so let's take a look at some runestones now. So during the earliest period, runic knowledge and the raising of runestones were really elite activities. We see runestones being raised by chieftains, high-ranking warriors, priests, that kind of thing. Not really the masses. And there's not really one standard type of inscription, but we do see some that are already commemorative of deceased relatives. Some are magical, some are even curses, and there's often interpretation issues because the language has changed so much since these early days that sometimes it's difficult to know what they're saying. Other times we're not sure if it's even really words. But anyway, the Tuna runestone that you see here from about 200 to 450 from Norway is a fairly certain inscription. So this one says, we made the runes after Wodoridas, my lord. For me, Wodoridas, 3 daughters, the most distinguished of the heirs, prepared the stone. So this is actually the earliest evidence for burial rites and inheritance documentation in Norway. So we have these three sisters who are not named, and they are commemorating their deceased father, Wodoridas, and presumably inheriting his property. And we also have the name of the rune carver, Wiwas. So that is pretty fascinating. And so some more early runestones. We have the Calibri runestone on the left here from the 5th century from what is now Sweden, from the west coast of Sweden. And it says, Thrawian Haitinas wise, or perhaps I was called Thrawian. And then we have the Shuva runestone from Gotland, which is now also part of Sweden, from about 400. And there isn't a translation for this one, because what this inscription is the runic alphabet, rune by rune, in order, and then it's followed by a strange symbol and a mysterious palindrome, Surius, which has not really been interpreted. So some people think that this runestone is a magical inscription because it was discovered facing downward into a grave. So the theory goes that this was meant to pacify the dead person in some way. However, it can also just be that somebody was practicing runic writing and the stone was just reused for the grave. And this is very plausible, actually. Stones were reused all the time, even in the Middle Ages. And actually, a lot of rune stones were taken from their original places and built either into the floors or walls of churches. So this could definitely have been something similar. All right, so let's take a look at a slightly later but still pre-Viking Age runestone. This is the Istabu runestone from 6th century Denmark, which is now part of southern Sweden. And it says, in memory of Hati Wolfar, Hati Wolfar, Era Wolfar's son, wrote these runes. So this is an especially fascinating stone because we have three close male relatives. We have a father and a son, and then the third could either be a brother or an uncle or something like that. And their names, you'll notice, are very similar. So actually, Hati Wolfar, Hathu Wolfar, and Hera Wolfar literally mean war host wolf, battle wolf, and sword wolf. And so not only do they begin with the same letter and have the same suffix, but they also have a prefix that has a war-like meaning. So most likely we have members of a warrior aristocracy, and they may have been similar to the berserkers whom you may have heard about, the Viking Age bear warriors. Only in this case we would have wolf warriors. So whatever the case is, this is definitely the social elite raising runestones still, and we'll see more of that. So coming to the early Viking Age, we have one of the most famous runestones in the world, probably. This is the Rök runestone from Sweden, and it was raised in about 800. And it was raised by a chieftain named Varin for his son Vemoder. And at about 700 runes, this is the longest inscription we have on the stone. And the inscription begins, in memory of Vemoder stand these runes, and Varin colored them, the father in memory of his dead son. And the inscription goes on, and it contains poetry, cipher runes, and 9 mysterious riddles which are still being reinterpreted today. So this runestone very much challenges the knowledge and the reading skills of the reader. And there must have been very few people at the time who could have been able to not only read, but also understand the inscription. So once again, this is the elite raising runestones. And the next is no different, actually. This is the famous Yelling runestone, which was raised by King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, somewhere between 960 and 985. And it says, King Harald ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm, his father, and in memory of Thurve, his mother, that Harald who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. So here King Harald is commemorating his parents and celebrating his achievements as King of Denmark. And some people believe that this runestone actually inspired the later Swedish runestone craze, which we'll get to in just a moment. But first I wanted to point out this symbol down here, which you might recognize. This is the Bluetooth symbol, or the Bluetooth technology. And this is actually a bind rune, which is a combination of runes. And in this case, it's a combination of the Younger Futhark H and the B, which stands for Harald Bluetooth. So there you go, you have runes on your phone. So now let's get to the late Viking Age runestones. 11th century Sweden can really be described as the golden age of runestones. And this is because the vast majority of Viking Age runestones were carved after the year 1000. Just to give you an idea, of the 2,057 Swedish Viking Age runestones, 2,039, so 99% of them, date to the year 1000 or after. We also see a wider range of society now raising runestones, not just the upper classes. So we see well-to-do farmers and even some freedmen, so freed slaves who are climbing the social ladder and want to show off their new status. And we also see runestones become formulaic. And why don't we take a look at the formula now? So most of these Viking Age runestones go something like this. Person A raised the stone in memory of person B, his or her relative. So a great example is this one from Novur Church from Uppling in Sweden. And it says, Thorgisur and Signotr, they raised the stone in memory of Vigr, their father. So here we have two named brothers who are commemorating their father, who is also named. And some runestones include additional information after this initial formula. So one example is they might mention where the person had traveled to during their lifetime, either on raids or trading expeditions or even on pilgrimage. And some of the places mentioned include England, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Russia, Byzantium, and the Middle East, which they called Circling. And one famous runestone that is a good example of this is the Gripsholm runestone, which stands in front of Gripsholm Castle. And this is connected to an ill-fated Viking expedition to the Caspian Sea in the 1030s, led by a man named Ingvar. And this runestone says, Tola had the stone raised in memory of her son Harald, Ingvar's brother. They traveled valiantly far for gold, and in the east gave food to the eagle. They died in the south encircled. And in case you were wondering, giving food to the eagle was a poetic way of saying killing people. So this is definitely a military expedition, and as we said, it didn't go so well. So you might be looking at some of these runestones and wondering, gee, were these actually painted like that? Well, they were definitely painted. Many runestones refer to having been colored, painted, or reddened. And some of them even survive with traces of original paint, such as the one you see here on the top left. You see traces of red, black, and white. So those were the normal colors that were usually used, but there is also evidence of blue, green, brown, and yellow. So painting a runestone not only made it more beautiful and made it stand out in the landscape, but it also had the distinct advantage of correcting possible carving mistakes. So if the rune carver accidentally carved the wrong rune, he would just go and paint the stone and paint the correct rune, and nobody would ever know, except for the runologists 1,000 years later. So yes, and so today most runestones are just maintained with this red paint, just in the inscription portion like that. But there are some that have been painted to show what they may have looked like. All right, then we come to runestones and religion. So although the practice of raising a runestone began during heathen times, it wasn't really until after the conversion to Christianity that this tradition started taking off. Yeah, about 60% of Swedish runestones display crosses, and many also contain Christian prayers or other messages. And in contrast, there's only very few that contain definitely heathen imagery or messages. Some runestones mention the building of bridges, the clearing of paths, or pilgrimage, all of which were considered pious Christian deeds. And some think that the sudden explosion of runestones after the year 1000 may actually be linked to the conversion itself. So raising a runestone with a big cross on it on your property was a pretty good way of letting people know that you were a Christian. So down below here, we just have some religious messages from runestones. The one on the left here is the Christian one, "May God help his soul," which is pretty standard. We also see the Mother of God and Christ mentioned fairly often. And then on the right, we have one of these very rare heathen messages, "May Thor hallow." So that's kind of a nice balance there. And so let's go to the Middle Ages now. So after about 1130, runestones pretty much come to an end. And in some areas anyway, they're replaced by these runic grave slabs, which would usually be set into the floors of churches. And so these, unlike the runestones, are associated with the grave of the person. And oftentimes, they don't mention the sponsor, so the people who raised the runestone, but only the deceased person. So instead of person A raised the stone in memory of person B, usually these typically only say, "Here lies person A," which sounds a lot like a modern headstone. So there are exceptions though, and actually both of these are exceptions. The one on the right here is a very late grave slab from Gotland, and it was commissioned by a woman named Hrothve for her husband Jacob, who had died from a gunshot wound in 1449. And it's very rare that we have the exact date of a runic inscription, but here is one of them. And then down here we have this very unusual and interesting coffin-shaped runic grave slab from early 12th century Upland. So there's some overlap with the very latest of the runestones. And this was commissioned by a woman named Kristen for her son Ali. So after about 1500, the Latin alphabet replaces the runes, and that's pretty much it. However, in modern times, sometimes people have created runestones in the Viking Age style, and the Brittingham runestone, which you see here, is one of them, and it's from 1960, and it's found on UW-Madison's campus. And it commemorates Thomas Brittingham Jr., who is the founder of the Brittingham Viking organization, and it emulates the style of late Viking Age runestones. And it's also in the younger Futhark, and but it is in modern Swedish, and it translates to a good friend lies a short way, though he may be far away. And this is from stanza 34 of the famous Old Norse wisdom poem Avamal. And that was it. Thank you. We can take questions.
Thank you, Tristan. I have some questions here. The first one is, isn't it interesting that there's no runestones found in Iceland when there's such a literate society? Do you think that's because they had such, you know, the long poems and oral tradition more?
Well, that's a very good question, but if we go back to the slide where we see the distribution of runestones,
Yeah.
here we go. So you see most of them are in Sweden, and actually most of them are in eastern Sweden. And so kind of the further west you go, you see Denmark has only 248, Norway has only 51. So it seems like the further west you go, the less common it is. So for whatever reason, I think it has something to do with that. We do see some runic grave slabs from the medieval period in Iceland, but not any Viking Age runestones. I think there are some small objects that are inscribed with runes that date back to the Viking Age, but you know, no runestones.
Oh, well, small objects, that leads to the next question, which is what accounts for the small divination stones that are used almost like tarot cards these days? How did that evolve from this, which is a very different, more commemorative thing? Was it a game?
Yeah.
You know, a game to teach children the letters, do you suppose? Or
Well, that is actually an interesting question there. And so it probably comes from the fact that the runes had names, which may have just been a mnemonic device. What people have said is that, oh, well, this rune meant such and such, and then they start reading into it. And that's basically where that comes from.
no?
And there's a little bit of evidence from the Viking Age. Most of it is actually from later literary sources that are about the Viking Age, that they may have been used individually sometimes as magical symbols, but this seems to have been kind of a secondary use rather than the primary use, which was to write things.
Okay. And my last question is, how did you get interested specifically? Because obviously you've studied a lot about, you know, the Scandinavian studies, Nordic studies. How did you specifically get interested in runestones?
Well, that's kind of a hard question, I guess, but I mean, I've always been interested in kind of ancient things, and so when I started Scandinavian studies, I was looking at medieval Scandinavia and Viking Age, and then there's, you know, this big corpus of runic inscriptions, and I just decided to start working with those.
Wow. Well, it's quite a study, a lot of study too. I've learned all these. Well, thank you very much.